a welcome to this year's Bill Silvers Annual Lecture on Holocaust, Genocide, and Contemporary Bioethics. Today's Yom Hashoah, a day of remembrance for one of the most horrific events of the 20th century and perhaps of all recorded time. I believe it's impossible to fully comprehend the horror and the evil of the Holocaust. But people like Bill Silvers and Alex Kor, I think, help show us the way to incorporate some form of recognition and remembrance for these events into our lives. Bill Silvers grew up in Carmel, Indiana, with a loving family and with a dear group of friends who are still involved in his life. His parents were Holocaust survivors, and when his mother came to the US, she was pregnant with him. He was trained at the IU School of Medicine and went on to an illustrious career as an allergist at the University of Colorado. There, he founded a series of lectures and activities to reflect and think about the Holocaust and about the involvement, the very sad and tragic involvement of physicians and researchers in the Holocaust and those atrocities. Dr. Silvers recently brought this quest for learning and reflection to his alma mater here at the IU School of Medicine. And the IU Center for Bioethics has been proud and privileged to host this series ever since. Our lecturer today is Alex Kor, fellow and past president of the American Academy of Podiatric Sports Medicine and a practicing podiatrist here in Indiana. His mother of blessed memory was Eva Kor, who brought a message of, who was a victim of Dr. Mengele at Auschwitz, and brought a message afterwards of healing and remembrance and even forgiveness to the world. A message that Dr. Kor will bring to us today and also will extend and apply to the areas of bioethics and medicine in a way that I think will be very helpful. I personally am very thankful to Dr. Kor for his work in this area, and to Dr. Silvers for creating this lecture series, and to you for being here, both in person and online. Dr. Kor.
Well, thanks so much. And my name is Alex Kor. And I know we have a lot of people online, and I want to thank everyone. I want to thank Dr. Silvers and thank Dr. Peter, Dr. Schwartz, and thank everybody here. So we're going to talk about the lessons of the Holocaust for healthcare, personal, professional, historical reflections. As far as the objectives, you can kind of read these on your own. I hope that you gain something from this lecture. Hopefully there's some medical students, research students. I know we have one philosophy candidate here, so I think it's important that we kind of keep in perspective what I'm going to tell you today regarding ethics and, as far as developing opinions regarding these issues and in the presence of previous unforeseen circumstances. I really don't have any disclosures, kind of have maybe two, affiliations. One of which is on the board of directors of Candles Holocaust Museum and Education Center. Troy Fears is here. He'll speak toward the end of this about what Candles is doing now. It's a Holocaust museum in Terre Haute, Indiana. And then I'm also a full-time podiatrist here in Central Indiana with Witham. So for those healthcare providers, I know we have some senior healthcare providers. If you think back to when you were in medical school or thinking about a medical career, I want to kind of give you a hypothetical, if you will. And the hypothetical would be that perhaps to continue your medical career, you were given an ultimatum. And that ultimatum would be that in order to continue in your medical career, you must join a club, an organization, or a party that maybe you didn't necessarily agree with the perspective and ideology of the party or organization. But if you did not continue, in order to continue your medical career, you unfortunately would have to join this party organization. And I think this would be a very difficult thing. If I think back to when I was a podiatry student in Chicago in the mid 80s, I don't know that I would have joined an organization that I didn't, agree with. And so if we kind of think about this and then think about a gentleman by the name of Hans Muench. Hans Muench was a young medical student in Germany, and he was given somewhat a very similar ultimatum. He was told he always dreamed of being a doctor. And in order to continue his medical career, it wasn't a club or organization, but as you probably know, he was asked to join or told to join the Nazi Party. He actually had a lot of Jewish friends. He did not believe in a lot of the things that the Nazi Party talked about and discussed, but he wanted to continue his medical career. And nobody knew in 1937 or 38 what was going to happen years later. So he reluctantly joined this organization, and he finished medical school and then went on to practice in Bavaria from about 1939 to approximately 1943. As kind of, if you know history, the Germans were starting to lose the war perhaps in 1943, and his practice was closed, and he was ordered to report to Auschwitz. Typically, what a lot of doctors were involved with was selections. And that would mean, for those of you that don't know this type of terminology, that would obviously be who lives and who dies. On the picture to the right is a selection platform. And as people came off the cattle cars, somebody was deciding who was going to live and who was going to die. Dr. Muench refused to do these selections. He was then ordered to do experiments on a group of prisoners in a barracks. And his first set of subjects happened to be Jewish doctors from all over Europe. And when he first met them, and they had been there for a while at Auschwitz, when he first met them, he actually went around the room and shook their hands. And they were not used to being treated like humans. They were treated like numbers. Everybody had a number. And one of the doctors said he seemed, very personal, had a personal interest, didn't insult, didn't humiliate anyone. He seemed oddly out of place. And he then did his experiments. And at the end of his first series of experiments, the doctor said, well, wait, once you say the experiments are over with, they'll kill us. So actually, he made up fictitious experiments and fooled his superiors. There was a book called The Nazi Doctors. He was referred to as the good doctor or the good Nazi. And over a year or so, he made up these fictitious experiments. At the end of the war, when the Nazis and Nazi doctors were fleeing, he gave one of his guns to a Jewish physician. And then, like many other Nazis and Nazi doctors, he was then went back to his hometown and was arrested. Dr. Louis Michaels, a prisoner who was one of the Jewish doctors, had worked with Muench actually at Auschwitz as well as Dachau. In preparation for this trial, he wrote letters to the chief administrator of the Hygiene Institute, saying that Muench, basically was very different from the very hateful SS officers. He had received many letters similar to this. And so when Muench's trial, I believe it was 1947 in Krakow, when his trial was happening, several of these Jewish doctors came forth, and he was the only Jewish doctor that was not either killed or sent to prison. And he actually went back to Germany and practiced medicine for years and years and years. What I'm going to do during this lecture is I'm going to switch gears periodically. I'm going to talk a little bit, as I just did, about Dr. Hans Muench, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple other people. Now, if we continue, regarding those same selections that I just mentioned that Dr. Muench refused to do, there was another doctor, Dr. Joseph Mengele, who most of you know. He was trained as an anthropologist as well as a medical doctor. In the mid-30s, he, as some of you may know, he was trained under Dr. von Verschuer, who was a geneticist who had an interest in twins. Well, there was a family of 5 from Ports, Romania, a small town northwest Romania near the Hungarian border. They arrived at the selection platform in late April of 1944. Obviously, Muench was not there. Mengele was part of the selection process. The family was made up of Father Alexander, Mother Jaffa, Edith and Elise, 2 older sisters, and there were 2 9-year-old twins. And so the Moses family was the only Jewish family in their village in Ports, Romania. It was part of the Transylvanian Valley. And really until 1944, they lived a very normal life. They did have an opportunity in 1940. Father Alexander went to Palestine. There were rumors that things were going to get bad. If you know history, this part of Hungary, Romania, was supposedly going to be spared by the Nazis, but in 42, 43, that changed. And sure enough, in 43, 44, that area was invaded by the Nazis. The twins were named Eva and Miriam. And as I said earlier, they were part of the Transylvanian Valley, a small village. There were about 100 families there. They were the only Jewish family. Eva can remember as a young child being in a carriage with her mother, and the mother said, "Oh, if you look up there, there's a castle, there's a bad guy there, don't go there." That was apparently Count Dracula or somebody with a similar name. So unfortunately, in mid-March of 1944, the entire family, the Moses family, Father Alexander, and the 4 children were taken from their village to a ghetto by the Hungarian military police, gendarmes, and they were then put in a ghetto. As many of you know history, they would liquidate the ghetto, similar to the selection process I just mentioned, and they were put in a cattle car. When I lectured to younger audiences, a lot of times they would say, well, do they know where they were going? Of course, they did not know where they were going. And they were in this cattle car. And again, this was not something with plush surroundings. There was a little peephole where they would get water during fuel stops. And initially the fuel stops, when they asked for water, they would have to give watches or bribe the people on the other side. And usually the language was always Hungarian. At one point, more than halfway during the 70-hour trip, the language was in German. The response was in German. So they obviously knew that this was not good. Once the cattle car stopped after 70 hours, Father Alexander told his family, if anybody survives this place, go to Palestine, go to Israel. And so the cattle cars opened, and mass chaos. Eva and Miriam held on tight to their mother. Their father disappeared into the crowd. The 2 older sisters disappeared in the crowd. And then somebody was running up and down the selection platform yelling, "Twins, twins," in German. They recognized that Eva and Miriam were dressed alike. They looked alike. And somebody said to the mother, "Yafa, are they twins? Is this good?" And next thing they know, the 2 young girls were taken out of their mother's arms. And the last thing they saw was their mother screaming and crying with their arms held out in vain. The twins, even Miriam, never saw their family again. They no longer had a family. Now you might ask, as most of you know history, a lot of times when these selection processes were done, young children, young women, in particular young children, were sent immediately to the gas chamber. Why were the twins not sent to the gas chamber? Well, the twins were being used in medical experiments by Dr. Joseph Mengele. A lot of people would ask, well, did they give consent to these experiments? No, there was no consent. There was no choice given to these twins. And during the time that they were there were approximately 3,000 twins, boys and girls, ages about 3 or 4 to age 15 or 16. Eva and Miriam were approximately 9 years old, and they were part of Mengele's experiments. They would inject one twin with the drug, and they would use the other one as a control. If one of the twins died during the experiments, again, this was without informed consent, they would kill the other twin and do comparative autopsies. And so over a period of time, the twins were wondering what was the reason for these experiments. They all had their theory, and even nowadays people speculate. David Marwell, who's a very well-known, renowned author, last couple of years did a book about Mengele and said that there was really no reason for these experiments. If you talk to any of the twins, they all thought, and still some of them are still alive, that Mengele was trying to find fertility drugs so he could perpetuate the German race. This is what Eva and Miriam thought, as well as a lot of the other twins. In this picture here, to the far right is Miriam, and then behind the little boy is Eva. And so, who was involved in these experiments? Was it just Mengele? No, it was actually, he was funded by a company called IG Farben. IG Farben, before the war, was known as the Bear Corporation, and after the war was also known as the Bear Corporation. And in the late 80s, Eva and Miriam and the other Mengele twins wanted the Bear Corporation to apologize. They did not apologize, and there was a class action lawsuit, which we can talk about later. So they were funding these experiments by Mengele. A lot of things happened between when Eva and Miriam arrived at Auschwitz in 1944 and their liberation later, which we'll talk about. One of the interesting things was that there were reconnaissance missions done by typically the Allies, United States, and in the late August, early September of 1944, Eva looked to the sky and saw a plane circling with a white cloud behind it, and she saw on the back of the plane the American flag. And the reason she knew it was American flag, again, she's 9 years old, was that she had an aunt in Cleveland, and they used to get letters when they lived in Romania, and she recognized the stamp, the same stamp that was on the plane. I always find this kind of interesting. So during the fall of 44, the experiments gradually became less and less. The Nazis at times would disappear, they would come back. This is somewhat a famous liberation picture. The interesting thing about this is that people know we celebrate on January 27th the liberation of Auschwitz. Eva and Miriam in the front row. Eva to the left, Miriam to the right. The lady in the white is the Red Cross. When on this date, on January 27th, the twins were in a barracks in Auschwitz I, if you're familiar with the camp. It was snowing outside and they saw something moving, and the Nazis were still in the area. They had to be careful to not be shot, but they saw something moving with camouflage. It was the Ukrainian army, Soviets coming to liberate Auschwitz. The Soviets were liberating from the east, Americans were liberating from the west. The Americans did not liberate Auschwitz. And so they liberated the twins. They said, oh, we'll be back in a couple of weeks. And this picture was actually a footage, a video that was done weeks later, probably even into early March. But people always associate this with the liberation on January 27th, but it was actually not on January 27th. So after the war, where will Eva and Miriam go? They initially went to an orphanage in Katowice, which is near Auschwitz. One of the other Mengele twins' mothers came to the orphanage and said she was an aunt, which she was not. And they eventually then went with Mrs. Changara and eventually ended up at their home 8 months later, hoping to see their parents and two older sisters. And unfortunately, they found out they were dead. The family dog was alive. Eva would say many times that the Nazis would kill people, but they did not kill dogs. They lived in Romania, eventually moved on to Israel in 1950. They were in the Israeli army. And so then in about approximately 1960, Shlomo Kor, also a survivor, introduced his brother Mickey to Eva Moses. There was no internet dating at the time. And they were married in 1960. And then Mickey, also a survivor, had already relocated to Terre Haute, Indiana, and their life began in Terre Haute, Indiana. Obviously, I've been using Eva's first name. Eva is my mother. Obviously, you probably know that. So many people joke, maybe not joke, but say my mom went from Transylvania to Tel Aviv and then on to Terre Haute. My father's story, which we're not going to talk about much, but just to say that his story is very interesting. He was actually rescued by an American GI from Terre Haute, Indiana, and that's how he ended up in Terre Haute. So I grew up in Terre Haute. My dad played the piano. My mom was involved in, a lot of civic activities. And then over a period of time, particularly in approximately the late 70s, once the house we had corn thrown in our house. This was a common custom during Halloween. My mom's initial knee-jerk response was that this reminded her of her past in Europe. And so she would chase these kids around the neighborhood. And unfortunately, this quickly escalated. In the late 70s, we had swastikas in our house in Terre Haute. So it was not always easy growing up in Terre Haute to two parents who survived the Holocaust. The fashion statement in the picture in the middle, I don't claim those pants anymore, but yes, that's me in the middle. And so one can say that, during this time and even into the 80s, my mom had a difficult time coping with life in Terre Haute. At times, I always thought I had a happy childhood, but at times I could see the pain in my mom's eyes, and certain things, certain activities would bother her. And the Halloween incident, which quickly became toilet paper, that's the picture to the top left. But, she had this yearning to find out more about what happened to her and the other twins. My aunt lived in Israel, and at times we would go back to Israel a lot, and they would talk about, oh, we know of another twin here, another twin there. And in 1984, they founded the organization Candles, and there were a handful of Mengele twins that founded the initial organization. Candles stands for, as you can see, the Children of Auschwitz Nazi Deadly Laboratory Experiment Survivors. And it gave, my mom kind of joked that, she's always very impressed when she gets a letter from the president of an organization, and she had a really hard time legitimizing her organization. So she thought, well, she'll make herself president, and when people would get letters, oh, it's president of Candles. And so this allowed a little bit more credibility to the organization. They found other twins. And then in 1985, 40th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, we went to Auschwitz for my first time. And so during the 1980s and 90s, and really, quite frankly, until 2019, I accompanied my mother. I've been to Auschwitz over 25 times. This picture on the left is kind of that famous picture. It's in Block 6 at Auschwitz I. And even the picture on the left, the top left, that's my mom behind the little boy again. These are all on the picture on the right, all Mengele twins. Recently, Troy Fears here, the executive director of Candles, we were in Poland in September, and there was a girl there, a medical student from Israel, and she's the granddaughter of one of the Mengele twins. And she, in this picture, could find her grandmother and a great-grandmother, I believe that's correct. And so, again, we're going to switch gears. I'm going to try to put this all together for you here. So you might be wondering, okay, we talked a little bit about this Dr. Muench, and then we talked a little bit about Eva Kor, Eva Moses Kor. What does the story of Hans Muench have to do with my mother? And more importantly, what does it have to do with medical ethics? So I'll answer the last question first. No, Dr. Muench did not do experiments on my mother. And so in 1993, my mom's twin, Miriam, my aunt, died. And in 1987, my aunt was going into kidney failure. And as we said, they were identical twins. And so my mother donated one of her kidneys to my aunt. When they took the kidney out of my aunt in Israel, that kidney, the transplant was done in Jerusalem, that kidney had not developed beyond the age of 10. Obviously, that's when the experiments, approximately when the experiments were done. For the first couple of years, 80, 88, 89, my aunt did very well. And then she started developing urinary tract polyps. She then was found to have metastases. In Israel, if you're beyond a certain level of cancer, a certain stage, they didn't treat her. She had it was part of socialized medicine. So she actually came here to Indiana University, and Dr. Larry Einhorn treated her, who happens to be in the audience today. And so she lived another year or so. And unfortunately, on June 6, 1993, my aunt died. So my mom really never had a chance. My cousins there buried my aunt right away. And so several months later, my mom gets a phone call from a doctor, Dr. Michalczyk, in Boston, saying, well, Eva, I know you're doing some lectures on medical ethics. It would be very interesting if you could bring a Nazi doctor to our meeting in Boston. And my mom liked to joke, even under these circumstances. And she said, well, Dr. Michalczyk, that's very interesting. I don't know where I can find a Nazi doctor. The last time I looked, they're not advertising in the yellow pages. Well, Eva, you like to joke, but maybe you can think of something. Well, the last project my mom and my aunt worked on was for a German TV station, ZDF. It's similar to PBS here. And my mom remembered that when the finished product of the documentary came out, there was a Nazi doctor who was cleared of all charges that was on that in that documentary. So my mom thought, oh, well, maybe that doctor would agree to come to Boston. And so a friend of the family, Susan Severide, the niece of Eric Severide from CBS News, Susan Severide had some contacts in Germany, and they contacted Dr. Muench. And obviously, that's who indeed was that doctor, Dr. Hans Muench, the same doctor we talked about at the beginning. And so my mom, which I actually saw this letter recently, I didn't realize it was only 2 weeks after my aunt passed away. But my mom, Tommy, is Suzanne's husband. She wrote a letter saying, you know, maybe you can ask Dr. Muench to come to Boston for this medical meeting so he could testify and help the Mengele twins and help medical research and account for what he was involved in. And this was a letter that my mom sent to Tommy and Suzanne. So my mom gets a phone call shortly thereafter. And unfortunately, they say, Eva, we have good news and bad news. The bad news is he's not coming to Boston. The good news is he'll give you an interview. So shortly thereafter, my mom then flies to Germany to Dr. Muench's house. My mom was having back problems and hip problems, and they were starting the interview, and my mom felt very uncomfortable. And so Dr. Muench kept on giving my mom pillows. Are you okay? Do you want water? And my mom looked at him at one point. She said, boy, you're not like the Nazi doctors I remember. You know, she was very terrified about going to meet a Nazi doctor. The last time she saw a Nazi doctor, they were not so nice. And so during the interview, she asked him, and her main purpose, and this is commonly confused, the main purpose was to see if she could help out other Mengele twins. She had just lost her twin sister. She was hoping that maybe Dr. Muench knew some of what happened with the medical experiments done by Mengele. And to my mom's great disappointment, Dr. Muench said, Eva, I'm sorry, I don't know anything about Dr. Mengele's experiments, but this part of life, this is what happened, and this is a nightmare I live with. And my mom said, what do you mean the nightmare I live with? Well, beyond helping these 20-some Jewish doctors, I also signed the death certificates for the gas chambers. And my mom said, well, Dr. Muench, this is very important information. Would you come to Auschwitz to document that you as a Nazi doctor were here at Auschwitz for all the Holocaust revisionists, all the people that say there was no Holocaust? And Dr. Muench didn't blink an eye. He said, of course, I'll come for the 50th anniversary for the liberation of Auschwitz. So my mom then came back to Terre Haute, and she told me, she goes, well, I've got a Nazi doctor, and he's going to come to Auschwitz. And I said, Mom, I don't think this is a great idea. The Mengele twins, particularly in Israel, aren't going to be so happy about your ideas. My aunt had died, and a lot of times my aunt would kind of filter these ideas, but there was no aunt there. My Aunt Miriam had passed away. So my mom was looking for a way to thank Dr. Muench, and this is commonly confused and misinformed to people. In fact, there was an article in the Jewish online magazine in October, The Tablet, that totally was incorrect. But my mom went to the local Hallmark store in Terre Haute looking to thank him. She was looking for a thank you card for a Nazi doctor. Nothing seemed appropriate. She was there for 2.5 hours. Eva, what are you looking for? And my mom was too embarrassed to say. She went to the liquor store. My parents didn't drink much. Nothing seemed appropriate. So at one point, she realized, I'll forgive him. I'll give him the highest honor. I'll forgive him for being a Nazi doctor. And so my mom then went, her English was her 5th language, went to her former English professor at Indiana State University and said, I wanted to work on this letter. letter of forgiveness that she was going to present Dr. Muench January 27th, 1995. And the professor said, Eva, this is a great idea, but your problem's not so much with Muench, it's really with Mengele. And at the time, my mom said, I'm not ready. I want to forgive Dr. Muench. I think this is really an honor I can give him. So on January 27th, 1995, I was there, and my signature's in the bottom left. Dr. Muench said my mom said her statement, and saying that, she was going to forgive him for being a Nazi doctor. Dr. Muench then documented that he was indeed there for, Auschwitz, and that he was part of the Nazi medical trials, and that there was indeed a Holocaust. And so my mom, over this period of time after this, realized that she not only was giving Dr. Muench a gift, she was giving herself a gift, that by forgiving, Dr. Muench and then later Dr. Mengele, she no longer had this chip on her shoulder. She could continue her life. And I truly believe, it probably gave her another 20 years or so of life, because she no longer was angry at the world, as she would say. So now we're going to shift gears again a little bit. So from that point on, my mom started giving more and more lectures on medical ethics. She gave lectures here at IU School of Medicine, thanks to Dr. Einhorn. And I think it's important, I don't like to read slides, but I will read most of these. These are her words. And this is perhaps for medical students, researchers, or even some of us senior physicians. As you begin your medical career, be aware that you've made an incredible, wonderful decision, but this is also a difficult choice. Continue to obey the International Code of Ethics. You must never violate the patient's or subject's human rights and human dignity, but you should continue to do research. Put yourself in the place of your subject, and how would you feel? Research is done for the sake of mankind and not for the sake of science. Never detach yourself from the subject that you serve. And, I think that's always a difficult one for me to agree with, but I think it's important that we do discuss it. Do not violate the Hippocratic Oath. Anytime you see or encounter a violation of human rights of a patient, I hope you will stand up against it. Respect the wishes of your subject and your patient. Never treat your patient like a number. The moment you do this, you're heading in the direction of Nazi medicine. And always, always provide an informed consent. So I've been a podiatrist for over 30 years, and a lot of people ask me how my mom's experiences, involvement in medical ethics affected me in my practice. Years ago when I was a podiatry student, I actually visited a podiatrist here in town, here in Indianapolis. I'm not going to say who it was, and I was just shocked at his bedside manner. I was a second or third year podiatry student, but he didn't offer any conservative care, and this happened to be a patient with an elective possible surgery on a bunion. And I thought, that just doesn't seem right to me. So for me, as I kind of continue my mom passes the torch on to me, I always try to offer and exhaust conservative care prior to offering surgery. I think it's important to make an effort, no matter what the patient's level of education, to thoroughly explain the condition to the patient, the family. And I see this a lot. I see doctors and residents talking at the patient, not to the patient. I think this is very important. And don't be motivated in any way by the financial benefits of offering a certain option to a patient, and treat each patient as if they're a family member. I think these are all important things that I try to abide by. And don't mince words with your patients. You have to be as honest as possible. So one last gear shift, if you like. So as mentioned previously, medical and scientific research, is of great importance, and many have benefited, many even in this room. In June of 1987, after having surgery and prior to starting chemotherapy for testicular cancer, a 26-year-old podiatry student was in a hospital in Chicago consumed with a number of thoughts. Would he be able to return to podiatry school? Would he need more surgery? Would he be able to tolerate chemotherapy? Would he indeed be able to successfully fight cancer and survive? So that podiatry student was then transferred here to IU Med Center, was enrolled in a study conducted by Dr. Lawrence Einhorn that offered 3 courses of chemotherapy instead of 4. And that 26-year-old podiatry student after being given informed consent and understanding the risk and benefits of the study, was enrolled in a study that he realized may or may not extend his life. And that podiatry student is now lecturing to you today. Thank you. I'm not done yet, but thank you, Dr. Einhorn. So I put this all together. Sorry. So in June of '87, my mom told me, "You're a survivor." No, she said, "I'm a survivor. Your father's a survivor. You'll be a survivor. You can beat this yourself." So I think we're all kind of a product of our past. And I think that many of us have incredible strength from our parents. And I think for me, it's that never give up, that perseverance that my parents have bestowed upon me. You know, I read a lot of books, and I used to have a radio show, and I once interviewed Carl Nelson, who's a former New York Giant football player, won, I think, the 1986 Super Bowl with Phil Simms. And he told me that, you know, he's had such a good life and everything's been positive for him. The year or two after he won the Super Bowl, he had Hodgkin's lymphoma. And he said, you know, in the back of my mind, you know, if something ever happened to me, if this is the worst thing that happens to me, I can deal with it and move on. In other words, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And I always remember that. So aside from being better healthcare providers, what life lessons did my mother offer? And I'd like to, we're almost toward the end here. Never, ever give up. Prevent prejudice by judging people on their actions. Forgive even your worst enemy because it heals you. Each of us can help change the world, repair the world. Tikkun olam, for those of you knowing Hebrew, and always appreciate your parents. And years ago, I started giving this lecture to podiatry students, and I talked to a friend of mine who's a podiatrist in Pennsylvania, and he said, you know, Alex, there's two types of doctors. Doctors that are there for their patients and doctors that feel that their patients are there for them. This will define what kind of doctor you will be. So if we return to my initial hypothetical, I cannot pretend to know what my response would be, or perhaps your response would be, but I'm sure that all of us would agree that Dr. Muench was there for his patients in the end. And so I'd like to entertain any questions here, and perhaps first here in the audience, and then I know there's maybe 50 people or so online, and then we have a couple other announcements and maybe one special thing for you to look at. Thank you very much.
Type into the chat and we will read them out. And people in the room, though, please feel free to come on up to speak into a microphone, or I can bring it to you if you'd like to be comfortable.
I stumped you all. Do we have any online questions?
I'll kick it off.
Sure.
I'm always willing to. So I wanted to know, in your mom's lectures and in yours on this topic and remembering her experiences and bringing this message, what sort of responses have you had from the students and the future researchers? Surprising responses, or I assume a lot of appreciation.
So what kind of responses have I had when I presented this to students? I've lectured to Marian University College of Osteopathic Medicine and some podiatry schools as well. You know, I think the first thing that I hear is that students are just overwhelmed because there's just too much information there. And I think that once they kind of digest the overwhelming information, I do think and I hope that students, medical students, kind of understand that they are in a situation where they can, you know, become healers and stay healers. And, you know, as we all know, if you know medicine, Nazi medicine, the healers became the ones causing harm. And I think that as a medical student, as a provider now, I think it's important that we all understand, you know, what our power is. And that, you know, from my standpoint, I think it's important that we educate our patients as much as possible so that they are able to make an informed decision. But I've had varying responses from, wow, I don't know what to say, recently I gave this lecture to a student. She goes, I have to think about this. I'll talk to you tomorrow. So I think a lot of them at times our students are overwhelmed. Yes, Dr. Einhorn.
Yeah, Alex, that was great. Your mom would have loved that lecture. She'd be very proud of you, and justifiably so. So as you know, when she went on this, if you will call it a mission of forgiveness, a lot of the Holocaust survivors in this community were angry at her. And she very eloquently said, it's not to forgive them, it's to make myself better and to learn forgiveness. What was your reaction when she first went on this odyssey?
So what was my reaction to the odyssey of forgiveness? My first knee-jerk response was, Mom, I don't think you know what you're doing, because I was always worried about what people would think of my mom and my dad. And I think maybe that's what a child does. And my mom would say, well, I don't care what they think. I want to do this for me, just like you said. And I didn't realize the power of forgiveness until I started going to some of her lectures, and people that had nothing to do with World War II were not Jewish would come to her and say, look, so-and-so, stole my girlfriend or cheated me of money. And I want to learn how to forgive them. And it was like, wow, I didn't realize the ramifications of what she was doing could apply to everyday life. So now looking back on this decision from 1995, which is a long time ago, I really think it's important that people think about forgiveness in their life. And I hope that none of us are faced with a dilemma to forgive a Nazi or somebody really, really bad. But I do think that throughout our lives, people hurt us. And at times the knee-jerk response is, hitting them or pulling their hair if you're a 10-year-old versus trying to forgive them. My mom would say, when kids learn reading, writing, arithmetic, they should also learn the skill of forgiveness. So I've learned a lot since 1995 because I've seen so many people that have benefited from my mom's forgiveness. And like you said, even in this audience, I'm sure there are people that do not agree with my mom's forgiveness. I get it. My dad didn't really agree with the forgiveness until years later. He was a big basketball fan, and he decided his favorite player was Dirk Nowitzki with the Dallas Mavericks, who happened to be of German descent. So he decided to forgive Dirk Nowitzki's family publicly. True story. But I think that it's a discussion. I think it's important that we talk about it because I think it can help a lot of people. It's not for everybody.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Kor. Andrea Parker asks, what was the involvement of Dr. Kor's father as compared to his mother regarding how they managed their survivorship?
What did my father regarding survivorship? So my father, let me give you 1978. There's a mini series known as Holocaust. It was maybe a year or two after Roots. My mom had not given too many public appearances, hadn't talked and lectured a lot. We were asked to speak at the local, we were asked to appear at the local NBC affiliate in Terre Haute. At the end of the movie, my dad starts crying hysterically. There's a little boy kicking a soccer ball, and he remembered himself kicking a soccer ball. So from that point on, my mom did a great job on TV. I realized I was 17 years old that I needed to help my father kind of overcome these demons because that's what was happening. And then my mom, I needed to encourage her to speak more. Over a period of several years, my dad, I don't know that he became a very accomplished speaker, but he enjoyed speaking. And so his survivorship was a lot of the things that he had a lot of skeletons in the closet that he kind of kept there. And the more he talked, the more he opened up and the more he was able to be a loving, caring father. So I think for me, as a 17-year-old, it was really me helping my father more than my dad helping me. But it's a great question.
One more question, and then we're going to have a short presentation about the campus museum, and we're going to see online.
Yeah. A special guest.
Okay, I have just a couple of comments. One is to thank you very much, Dr. Kor, for this talk. Personally, it means a lot to me because I was scheduled to be on a program with your mother at the Medical History Museum shortly before she passed away, and so I did not have the opportunity to meet her, but listening to you was a way of listening to her.
Thank you.
As a bit of encouragement, we have a medical humanities program here at IUPUI, and they have an annual student research conference. And last month, at the research conference, there was a paper, actually a poster session by medical students that was titled, "What Medical Students Can Learn from the Holocaust." So the word's getting out.
Wow, thank you.
Thanks, Bill. So Troy, why don't I give you the floor to talk about the Candles Museum, and we'll call up the.
My name is Troy Gears, Director at Candles Holocaust Museum and Education Center, which is located in Terre Haute, about an hour west of here. And it's a privilege to be here with you tonight, both in person and everybody online as well. And I want to invite you to come to Candles. We are Indiana's only Holocaust museum. We've been there about 27 years, founded by Alex's mom, Eva Kor. And, he didn't mention it tonight, but it's a fascinating story how Mickey Kor, his father, and Eva end up in Terre Haute, and then how Indiana's only Holocaust museum is in Terre Haute. It's fascinating. And I encourage you to come to Terre Haute if you get a chance. Go to our website at candlesholocaustmuseum.org to find out more information about Dr. Mengele and Dr. Muench as well. Obviously, we are the only museum in the world actually that focus on the Mengele twins. And so we talk in depth about Dr. Mengele and even Dr. Muench because of Eva's road towards forgiveness. So I appreciate and would love for you to come by. One of the most special things in our museum is a program called Dimensions in Testimony. And it is an interactive exhibit where you can actually talk to a Holocaust survivor and have a conversation. It was done by the USC Shoah Foundation, which is funded in large part by the filmmaker Steven Spielberg, who I'm sure many of you know. But on the campus of the University of Southern California, he did that in the late 2000s. And Eva Kor was one of those participants. And so it's a fascinating thing to be able to talk to a Holocaust survivor. And you can see that at our museum at Candles. You can also see that here in Indianapolis at the Indiana Historical Society. They have an Eva exhibit going on right now. It's been going on for the last year, and it's going to go until the end of January, I believe, of this year, another full year. And so if you can't make it to Terre Haute, hopefully you can make it to the Indiana Historical Society here in downtown Indianapolis and check out the Eva exhibit. So, but it is a fascinating way to be able to have a conversation with your mom. And I think we might be able to kind of explain that and show that off a little bit tonight.
Thanks. Thanks, Troy. Thank you, Troy. Brian, you're still up there? Might need a little help. I got it. So we're gonna have a special guest now, okay? And give me a little second here, like this. Oh. I'll just do this. There we go. There she is. Okay. Let's see here. Technical difficulties are always fun. Nope. I'll get it. Well, does anybody have a question for my mom? And we'll try to get the microphone. Oh, I bet it's audio. Let's see here. Yeah, that brings, I did that, and then hit audio. Yeah, I think it's working. It says. I'll try this. No, that's okay. Does anybody have any questions? And we'll listen silently to my mother. One of the fun things to do, I mean, this for me, and a lot of people ask me, you know, how is this to talk to your mom? Unfortunately, after she passed away, my mom used to have arguments with herself. She would talk to herself. I have it on video where she was talking to herself and she would have arguments with herself. So this was created before she passed away. And so it was always interesting. You know, for me, I wish my dad had a similar type technology, because I think it's just amazing that we can talk to her. At times when I have medical students, I'll bring this out on my laptop and start talking to her. But some of the questions are just amazing, that how she responds. And this was filmed in Los Angeles. It was in a bubble, if you will, with thousands of cameras. She always wore blue, and they filmed this over 10 days, and you can almost ask her anything. I think we're trying to get this up and running here, but in fact, we'll ask her what is, and I know some of the answers.
I don't know. I like all kind of things. I like McDonald's, my favorite restaurant. Chicken McNuggets. I like peanut butter and jelly. But I like all the fattening sweet stuff, except I can't eat it. Mengele was very present looking. He had a gorgeous face, a movie star face, and very pleasant actually. He was maybe 5'9", dark hair, dark eyes, and the eyes were the focus. That when I looked into his eyes, I could see nothing but evil. And therefore, people say that the eyes are the center of the soul, or the mirror to the soul. And in Mengele's case, that was correct.
Does anybody here online have any questions they want to ask my mom?
Yeah, so online, Andrea Parker asked again, what do you see as your biggest strength as a result of your experience?
I'll ask my mom.
No more wars. No more experiments without informed consent.
Didn't know that one. Sorry?
Well, I think it sounds like you picked up on the word experience.
Right. So this one will hit home here.
My name is Eva Kor. I was born in Transylvania, Romania, in the village of Port. The family consisted of my father, Alexander Moses, my mother, Jaffa Moses, my oldest sister, Edith, middle sister, Alice, my twin sister, Miriam, and me. In 1940, the Nazis occupied our village and we became subject to Nazi rules. In 1944, we were taken to an area ghetto of Czechy, and we were there 2.5 months, then loaded into cattle cars directly to Auschwitz 4 days later. The whole family disappeared within 30 minutes. Miriam and I were used in experiments by Dr. Mengele. We survived. We were liberated by the Soviet Army on January 27, 1945.
One more maybe, unless somebody else.
Well, Alex was 26 years old when he developed when we discovered it was stage 4 testicular cancer that metastasized in his lungs and his lymph nodes. He luckily was part of the experiment at Indiana University with Dr. Einhorn that ultimately discovered the cure for testicular cancer. As he heard about it from his doctor after the surgery, that the tumor was actually cancerous, he was devastated. 26 years old, in school, studied podiatric medicine. That was the last thing on his mind. And for 2 weeks, I could not get him to stop crying. So I called him after 2 weeks and I said, Alex, that's enough crying. I was in Auschwitz. I was alone. The doctors I had did not want me alive. They wanted me dead. I made the decision that I will survive. And I can tell you one thing. If you are not going to decide to survive, I don't think I can help you. It is your decision. You will have to use everything in what you have. He got very angry at me and hung up the phone, called me back next day and said, Mom, I think I understand what you are trying to do. I will be okay. This is my Auschwitz. This is my Holocaust. I have to survive it.
I don't know if anybody else, I know we're right at an hour. I think Dr. Einhorn, I was stage 2, not stage 4. She got that wrong, but I appreciate it. Thank you very much, Peter, Pierce, everybody, Brian up there, and thanks everyone for being online. So I really appreciate the opportunity.